Lou Eisen, boxing historian and writer, and we have a very special guest today. We have Mark Kram Jr., and we're going to discuss his wonderful book on Joe Frazier, which is a must-have for any serious boxing fan. And Frazier was an incredible person. Mark Kram Jr. is the author of Like Any Normal Day, A Story of Devotion, which was awarded the 2013 PEN ESPN Award for literary sports writing. Formerly a senior writer for the Philadelphia Daily News, which is one of the newspapers on the planet. He was recipient of the 210 Sigma Delta High Award for feature writing. His work has appeared numerous times in sports writing. He's also contributed articles to Philadelphia Magazine and the New York Times. He's the son of the late Mark Kram, highly regarded writer for Sports Illustrated, and the author of the controversial book on the rivalry between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, Goes to Manila. Mark Kram Jr. is our guest, magnificent writer, and it's absolutely a pleasure and a privilege to have you on today. Welcome.
I'm delighted to be with you, Lou. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. And I got to tell you, so I started to read the book this week. I mean, I've read it before, and I started to read a little bit again. I figure I'll read the first couple chapters, and then I'll read the next couple chapters, and then I'll read the next 3 or 4 chapters. Then I'm reading the whole book again. You can't put it down. And it's such a wonderful description of, it puts you inside Joe Frazier's heart and mind. And you knew Frazier very well.
I did. I came to know him well after his career. I began writing for the Philadelphia Daily News in 1987, and it was after that, during my tenure at the Daily News, that I got to know Joe fairly well. You know, I was during a very difficult and interesting time in his life where he was sort of, you know, distancing himself from his career, and that was not an easy process for Joe. You know, I don't think he ever really formally retired, to tell you the truth,
Right.
without an announcement. He just sort of So I got to know him during his post-boxing career, put it that way.
Yeah, he seemed to be drifting at some point, that he was sort of lost. I mean, without boxing, it didn't really seem he had a purpose or focus. Is that fair to say?
It is, and he had money troubles. He didn't handle his money terribly well, so he was always looking to turn a buck. You know, he had the gym up on North Broad Street, and you know, he had that more or less to get the kids off the street and sort of serve the same role for those kids that the police athletics served for him when he was coming up. But he was made a lot of appearances. He was beloved in Philadelphia. He was someone that Joe understood what it meant to be a champion in the city. And then he had a certain stature, and all sorts of people would flock to the gym. As far away as England, they would come and want Joe to train him, to advise him, to manage his career. So Joe kept his hand in boxing as a trainer and manager, but with limited success, I'd say.
What happened to the money? Did he misspend it? Did people rip him off?
He spent it. You know, he spent it. There were some bad investments, and some investments in which were not done in an orderly fashion. He came out of an impoverished childhood in Beaufort, South Carolina. And there's the culture of poverty was in play for Joe, in the sense that what that is that if you grow up in extreme circumstances and you come into a lot of money, the feeling is that there's, your whole life, you're not planning for tomorrow. You're just living for today. And I think Joe fit that fit that description rather well. Joe liked to let the good times roll, and they rolled him into bankruptcy, more or less.
Yeah, I mean, that applies to so many athletes, not just boxing. And I remember reading an article in Sports Illustrated, Mark, about Rocket Ismail, who played up here in Canada before he went to the States, and he was broke. And there was a lawyer, I think, in Dallas who essentially formed a company for athletes. The lawyer said, "I'm already wealthy. I don't need the money." But he wanted to help them. So when people would come to different athletes, ask for money, whether it was their relatives or friends, he would say, "You got to give me an outlined financial plan of what you want to spend to every cent, how
Right.
you plan to pay it back, and it has to be done by a bank manager or an accountant."
Right. Well, it's interesting, if you look a generation later, how well Sugar Ray Leonard handled his affairs. And he had a very sharp guy by the name of Mike Trainer handling his contracts, his negotiations, and he was a guy that had a lot of integrity, shall we say. And so it was a whole different thing, but Joe, it was catch as catch can. He made a lot of money, but when you make a lot of money and you come in from that environment, everybody's lining up to get with their hand out in one way or another.
Right.
And Joe was basically a generous guy. He was a big-hearted guy. Like Ali in that respect. They were fundamentally soft touches, basically. Ali gave away money that people had would never be aware of, and so did Joe. They were. That was how they were.
That's one of the most beautiful stories in your book about the person he saw. I think it was in the wheelchair.
Right.
Person. I mean, that was it was a really emotional story. How he picked this stranger up and took him home and got him stuff and gave him money. And
yeah, he was driving to Atlantic City. We had his son Hector and another fighter by the name of Kevin Dublin in the back of his limo, and they were coming down Broad Street, and they see a legless man wheeling himself across the street, Broad Street, with a can of kerosene in his lap. And Joe pulled over. He's got a long fur coat on, white fur coat, and a cowboy hat, and he was he picks the guy up and puts him in the car. The fighters put the wheelchair in the trunk, and they drive to this man's house, which is a narrow street in North Philadelphia. And it's got, it looks like an abandoned, vacant house. It's got, the windows are covered with quilts and very bare surroundings. And so Joe takes him inside, and, he pulls out a roll of bills from his sock. He called it the love. He said, "You look like you could use some love," which is what Joe called money, and peeled off a couple hundred for him.
Wow.
Gives him some autographed pictures. And, Kevin Dublin told me that on the ride to Atlantic City, Joe was mysteriously quiet. He usually was kind of a chatterbox, driving, but he was quiet. And you could see there was a tear in his eye. He was thinking about this. And, and they could have, we don't know what he was thinking about, but you could say, well, he had told the boys in the back, he said, "See, that was a man." And he was trying to show these kids who were kind of wayward kids at the time, very much involved with, getting in street fights and drugs and all that sort of thing, theft, that, that's what it was to be a man, taking kerosene to heat your house for his family. So was Joe thinking about that when he was tearing up, or was he thinking about his father, who had one arm? His father's arm was shot off when Joe's mother was carrying him in the womb.
Wow.
And there was a fracas, and Joe's father was a bootlegger, and there was a fracas over one thing or another at a party, and the guy pulled out a shotgun and shot Joe's father's hand off. So was he thinking about that? Was he thinking about how his own father and the struggles that he had? So there were, what I've tried to achieve with the book is portray a multi-layered picture of Joe, and draw in all that was going on around him, all the cultural and societal things, not just with his 3 fights with Ali,
Right.
but all of that was going on in the 60s and the 70s and what have you. So a textured portrait of him is what I was aiming for.
We certainly achieved that, and just you get the feeling reading that he's thinking this is wrong, and I can change this. This is fundamentally wrong in our society, which is so wealthy that a person has to live like this.
Yes, he was. As I say, he was a very kind-hearted man, and I wanted to come across on that. The book is by no means a Valentine to Joe. I mean, it's not. That would be unfair to his memory to write, kind of hand him a bouquet of roses in this book.
Right.
However, I wanted to get across what a fundamentally decent and kind-hearted man he was, and he was that. He would see a driver stranded on the side of the road, and he did this not once but any number of times. Say the person had a flat tire, he would pull over and get out of his car and get the jack and fix the tire. He said, "Can you imagine that you're stranded on the highway, and the heavyweight champion stops by to give you a hand?" Well, that's what he was. He was, and he would tell his nephew or whoever was saying, "No, not we're not doing this again, are we?" And he says, "That could be your mama out there, or your father." So right. Joe had a sense of decency about him that were really touching, and
there's something you said that just struck a chord to me. George Chuvalo loved him.
Yeah,
they were best friends, and Chuvalo was very, very mentally distraught when Joe passed away. He was out in Western Canada giving this anti-drug tour.
Yeah.
And he canceled it when he heard Joe was sick. And, to get a flight from Calgary directly to New York is not easy, but he did. But he couldn't get to the next morning, and he just missed him. And so Joe, or George was hospitalized for a bit because he was crushed. I mean, he loved him. And I had seen them at the Hall of Fame together, hugging each other. And George always had a big hug and a kiss for Joe.
Right.
And they were like brothers. They hung out. And the first time I met Joe I was doing stand-up comedy, and it was a small town 20 minutes outside of Toronto, in Pickering, in a bar owned by a Canadian Football League player. And I said when I walked in, that guy at the bar looks a lot like Joe Frazier. It is Joe Frazier. And I thought, oh my God, what on earth is Joe Frazier doing here? And so I said, can I meet him? And he said, sure. And he had a cold look on his face, but I spoke to him and I said, what brings you here? And he said, why else would I be here? I'm here to see my brother George. And they, and I had known from people always asking Ali this and Ali that. I didn't want to upset him.
Right.
So I just said to him, when you won the world heavyweight title, was the joy, did it hit you immediately? Or did it take you a week or two for it to really sink in? And he said, the joy of winning and achieving your goal is incredible at that moment. But he said, it takes time for you to realize, wait a sec, I am the champ.
Yeah. It's interesting. People ask me where Joe fits in the pantheon of great heavyweights. And, whether he's in the top 5 or the top 10, or, everyone has their own way of judging these things. First of all, it's very hard to move fighters around in time to say that Gene Tunney and Joe Louis how they might have fared with Ali and Frazier and that group. But I tend to look at it at the, did the fighter meet his greatest moment? What did he produce in his greatest moment? And if you were to use that as a criteria, you'd have to say Joe was in the top 3 or 4, I would say,
If not
because
higher.
there was no
Absolutely.
greater moment than the first Ali Frazier fight. And although he lost the third fight, no one will deny that he was what a courageous performance it was under dire 100-degree temperatures, 15 rounds. I don't know. To me, in my eyes, and I know people will dispute it, I've seen Joe listed as 9, 10. Some even say that he's, not even in the top 20, God forbid.
That's
But
ridiculous.
my view is that where is what did the fighter do? What indelible moment did he produce?
He was put on this earth to beat Ali, and he did his job. But he also beat other.
Yeah,
He beat other great fighters. You can't rate him anything under the top 1 or 2. I mean, because you could put him in any era, and he still wins. There's no one you can say other than George Foreman, and he wasn't really focused on that fight, or as trained as well as he should have been. But
right.
there isn't another fighter you could say would walk over him. Just wouldn't happen.
I think, for instance, he would have destroyed Tyson.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think he would have utterly destroyed Tyson.
I wanted to ask you
And
about
I hear
that.
Tyson. Yeah, with all due respect to Tyson, I look at his record, and I look who he beat, and I just don't see it. I don't see the greatness there. And I think if Tyson he's an honest man. I think if he were to look at himself, I think he'd admit it. He's a brand name for sure. And he had an interesting career. I think he's an interesting guy. I really do. I think he's a very interesting guy. But I think that the notion that he's somewhere comparable to the fighters from the 60s, and I'm not talking about just Joe and Ali. I'm talking about some of the other guys who were campaigning in the 60s, he's just not. Liston. Oh my gosh, Liston. Yeah. I mean,
Cleveland Williams. Yeah.
Cleveland Williams. Even that guy from Philly who no one remembers anymore, Leotis Martin. He was a very tough fighter.
Yeah, and Leotis Martin knocked out Liston.
Yeah, in his last fight.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not saying that Tyson wasn't better than Leotis Martin. All I'm saying that those fighters in that era, I mean, to get out of that, to rise above those caliber of fighters in your career, as Joe did, and Ali did, it took some doing,
Yeah. Tyson depended on intimidation, and as you know better than anyone on this planet, an army couldn't intimidate Joe Frazier.
Oh my gosh, no! Oh my gosh!
I mean, just laughed at him.
Yeah, I mean, I remember Tyson fighting Frank Bruno. Bruno must have said the sign of a cross 50 times in his corner before he came out. It's just, that's right. He intimidated guys. He was a quick fighter, but he could be offset, as Holyfield proved. And I don't know. I don't want to get into a long Tyson thing, but I just bring him up to sort of talk about where Joe fits in history. And I think he fits in history more favorably than some might have it.
Where he came from in South Carolina, in Beaufort, you were saying, is it almost, how do I put this, unbelievable, almost unimaginable that a person from that impoverished a background could rise above his circumstances and the racism endemic in that area everywhere to achieve world status as an athlete. I mean, it's almost impossible.
Well, I know that as a boy, he hung a burlap bag filled with corn cobs and rocks from a tree and used it as a heavy bag. And I know that he saw Joe Louis pass through Buford doing an exhibition when Joe was still quite young. Um, so, and that, he had this notion that he would be heavyweight champion one day. But if you add up everything together, he was not what I would say on the fast track to Madison Square Garden.
Right.
He got into some trouble. He was a poor student. He was truculent with his teachers. He got into some fights and some trouble. It was a very racist environment down in Beaufort. And his mother, he became part of the migration north for many African Americans at that time. And he was sent to live with some relatives in New York, figuring that there was nothing for him in Beaufort, but there might well be something for him in New York. Well, he got there and couldn't really find a job, and he got involved with stealing cars. He'd steal cars and take them to the chop shop. He'd get $50 a car. And, his relatives saw that he was skirting danger, and they sent him to live with his sister in Philadelphia. Her name was Maisie. And her and her husband, and he got down there, and Maisie sat him down and said, "Look, Joe, if they called him Billy, his nickname was Billy because his
Right.
father had called him that." He said, "Look, Billy, if you get into trouble, there's nothing I can do to help you. But if you go to the police athletic league and get to know the cops, you'll have it'll be to your advantage." Well, Joe wanted to do right. He said, sure, he'd do it. He was overweight. He was 30 pounds overweight, couldn't fit into any of his clothes. He was out of shape. And so he went over to the gym, and they started fooling around with the heavy bag, and they soon saw that he had a natural left hook, that he just had tremendous power in his left hook. And sort of that was the beginning. He ended up getting a job in a slaughterhouse in Philly to keep body and soul together, and trained, and the cops took good care of him. And the cop, one in particular, ran the 23rd PAL, was a fellow by the name of Duke Dugent. And through Duke, Joe got to know Yank Durham, who used to come by the gym. And next thing you know, he's competing for the Olympics and winning the Olympics.
How
So,
long was he? Yeah, how long was he boxing at the time he won the Olympics?
3 or 4 years, I guess.
Okay, so quicker than Foreman when Foreman got into it.
Yeah, I mean,
Not as quick, it's just say longer.
he got into the Olympics because Buster Mathis, who had beaten him in the
Broke.
trials, Buster had broken his hand or thumb or what have you, and so Joe was the replacement, and he took advantage of it. Won the gold medal, and when he came back to Philly, wanted to turn pro. Nobody would really make a deal for him. It wasn't like today where you come back with the Olympic gold and you're lavished with all sorts of deals and riches and what have you. They didn't think he was tall enough, and or at least the cognoscenti didn't think he was tall enough, big enough, that he'd have trouble as a heavyweight. And it was only because his manager, with Reverend Gray in North Philly, who was a pastor, they got together some business leaders in Philadelphia to form Cloverlay, which was a they'd invest a certain amount of money, and that would sort of keep Joe in training, and that's how it came to being. His early career, it really didn't take off until Yank brought in Eddie Futch from the coast to pick fights for him and to teach Joe. And of course, we all know Eddie was a
Genius.
what an incredible teacher he was.
Right.
So,
He's one of the greatest ever.
oh yeah, no question, and a good man, a really good man.
I asked him at the Hall of Fame one year when Angelo introduced me, Angelo Dundee, and I asked him, "Did you ever regret stopping the third Frazier fight?" And he grabbed my wrist. He said, "Son, I've seen 7 men die in the ring.
Yeah,
I wasn't going to see another one."
That's right. That's right. And Joe was helpless.
Yeah.
He couldn't see out of either eye.
Yeah.
And there's this myth around that Ali was going to quit on his stole. And some people that I respect seem to believe that. I don't believe it. I don't think that would have happened. I don't think Angelo would have let him quit in the last round, before the last round.
Yeah.
They knew what kind of shape Joe was in.
When I spoke to Hugh McIlvanney at the Hall of Fame in Canastota, he said, "I was sitting less than 3 feet behind Ali's corner. I never saw, and I could hear everything." He said he never said he was going to quit.
No, of course.
He said he was exhausted. He felt like death, but he never said, "I'm not going out."
No. That's one of those urban legends that have passed down, that there seem to be so many of them these days, but there was no chance that was going to happen. And Futch did the right thing. What's interesting is the postscript there. Ali didn't want to come down and see the press, or didn't want to entertain the press, and until Bobby Goodman, who was handling the press, the media, said, "Joe's down there, and Joe's going to go." And then Ali says, "Give me my comb," and he gets himself together. But later that night, Ali could barely move. His body was beaten so hard, badly.
He was never the same again.
Every organ in his body had been pulverized. And Joe was down there dancing with the knockouts. He was singing and dancing. And so, anyway, you can draw from that what you want. But I'll tell you, there were 2 winners that night, in my view. And if you look at it another way, there were 2 losers. So,
yeah, I mean, you can't, if you watch that fight and you don't come away in love with Joe Frazier, then you have no soul.
Because
this was an all-time, not just one of the top 1 or 2 prize fighters ever to have lived, going back 300 years, but one of the most decent, fundamentally kind people, and one of the greatest athletes of the last 1,000 years. And I'm not sure if it was David Halberstam who said it, but someone, or Thomas Hauser, who said that they were fighting for the championship of each other.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that. I think that was Tom Hauser said that. I think so, but it's true. To me, it was the greatest sporting event in of the last century.
I agree.
And I wasn't at all of them, but I know a fair amount about a lot of them. And to me, just given everything that was involved, and the stature of the 2 men and where they were in their lives, and but the tragedy is that they didn't just tear off the gloves and just hang up the gloves after Manila. Well, that was the sad part of it all.
Freddie Pacheco thought that Ali should have retired after the first Frazier fight, and certainly after the Manila fight, he said to him, "Organs don't recover from beatings like that. It's not like getting calloused hands when you play guitar."
Well, you're right. And I was musing today, what if Joe had retired after the first Ali fight? Just think of how we would think of him today, But that was not going to happen. Because boxing was what got Joe where he was in life, his station in life. He wasn't going to give that up.
And
What was he going to do?
right,
Sing. He could have been a singer, I guess.
but at that point, unlike today where there's 4 world champions and 1 world, there
Right.
was only Joe Frazier, and so very few people get to have that designation. You're the heavyweight champ. You're the toughest human being on the face of the earth.
Oh
And
yeah.
how can you give that up?
Yeah, there was a very clear line to who was the best. The ring rankings had yet to be tarnished. People still put a lot of credit into the ring rankings at that time. And people looked, and that was an important barometer of who was who at that time, if you remember in the 60s, and even before then, of course, but 60s and 70s. So, yeah, so what they achieved and what Joe achieved came at a high cost, obviously, in many ways. Uh, you know, we don't know the full extent of what happens when you have CTE, when you have that sort of brain damage, how it affects your behavior. We do know that some of the behavioral aspects of it were alarming. Um, and there's no question Joe and Ali had that. Whether there are some that might want to debate it, but to me
There's no debate.
it's beyond debate.
Yeah, it's beyond debate because all fighters end up. It's not possible to
Yes,
do it and end up without that.
yes, and when they finally get around to when they finally get a way to judge the extent of brain damage before. Right now, you can only judge it in autopsy, whether someone had CTE. But when they get to the point where they have a test for it, that's going to create a sea change for the NFL and for boxing and a lot of these contact sports, because it's my hunch that it's a lot more prevalent than people suspect, particularly with in youth sports, and you're just seeing the beginning of it at that time, and you see cases of you know you see cases of players at 18, 19, 20 years old dying, and it explains a lot of this aberrant behavior, this extreme behavior, impulsiveness, drug use, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know.
But doesn't it?
We're never going to see another era in boxing
Hmm.
the way that's the thing. You're not going to see boxing be anything close to what it was during the Ali Frazier years. It's
Right. It's a niche sport now.
right, right. I mean, everything has its season, right? Uh, to me, when I was working as a sports writer, I never thought of it as the golden age of sports writing. But when you look see how it's evolved or devolved over the last 15 years or so, you can say, well, geez, that was the golden age. I mean, it's never going to come back the way it was. And by that, I mean, you had columnists. Every city had a couple of columnists, and the page counts were deep, and the travel money was there to go do interesting stories. There was a great, people could have careers as sports writers. You can't. I suppose you can do something that's called sports writing, but it's nothing like it was then. Today it's you're tweeting and everything's so fragmented. Uh, and I don't want to sound like an old shoe here, but the truth of the matter, I guess my point is everything has its time, and
Right.
boxing had its time.
I know definitely. In that era, you had the '69 Mets. In '73, you had Secretariat.
Yeah.
Secretariat came to Toronto to run at the Queen's Plate, and
Sure.
I didn't want to go. And my father looked at me and said, "Secretariat's the Muhammad Ali and Joe Louis of horse racing, and you're going to
Yes.
live to regret this day for the rest of your life." And I
Yeah.
did. I do regret it, because he said, there'll never be another horse like this. And
Yeah, and horse racing is another example of a sport that's you know, in steep decline. Uh, so so what I wanted to do with Frazier is preserve him in the context of his times,
right.
and I think that you know anyone that's interested in what it was like, when Ali and Joe fought, they might find my book. You
Did
know.
did Frazier realize that he himself had millions of fans throughout the world? That did he really understand how much he meant to people? How much people
Yes,
loved him?
yes, I think he did. I think he did, and I think he appreciated it tremendously. I think he really did. He as I said earlier, he understood what it meant to be a champion and in a city. And if you needed to find Joe Frazier, all you had to do was go up to North Broad Street and knock on the gym door, and he would be there. He would welcome you in and treat you like an old friend.
Did,
And that's how he was. See, these fighters from those eras, these athletes writ large, had there was no pretense about them the way you see today. You see athletes today, they have these phallics of this entourage that's sort of surrounding them, and they're very hard to get to. Even for the press, they're hard to get to. But back then, you could spend time and get to know these fighters. They would tell you their stories. They enjoyed that piece of it. For the most part, there were some that were reluctant, but for the most part, and sports writers were the storytellers of that time. But that day's all gone. I mean, the athletes are making so much money, and they're so much guarded. They're so well guarded by press, media relations people, and agents, and so forth and so on. That we don't have that relationship with fighters the way we did. You could feel like you knew Joe Frazier. Today, do you feel like you really know who the top stars are in boxing? Do you have a sense of who they are as people? I would ask you this because you're
right.
more involved in it than I am. Do you feel like you have a textured view of who these guys are?
No,
Yeah,
I know their names, but no. I mean, I'm 62, so when I was a kid, you knew who all 8 champions were in every division,
right.
and
Right.
and I don't know if it's because I was Canadian or it was just me, but how could you not love Joe Frazier? He
Yeah,
smiled to everyone. He had $1 million smile. He was kind to he didn't dislike the people he fought. He went to visit Chevalo in the hospital every day after he
sure.
broke his orbital bone, and that was a friendship and a love they had for each other that never diminished. And it brought me to tears at the Hall of Fame each year when all George would do when he got there, "Where's Joe? Where's Joe?" And then he'd see him, and George would open his arms and hug him and just drown him in kisses. And Frazier was so happy to see him, and they would just be in their own world for the whole weekend. They would just sit and talk to each other and laugh and giggle, and it was great to see them be able to do that. And George, and when I asked him who was the tougher fight, Ali or Frazier, he said Frazier because he said Ali was magnificent, but you couldn't hit Frazier. He was so quick, and he was moving so much. He was impossible to time. And he said if you
Yeah.
watch the Ali fights, Ali missed 5 times as many punches as he landed. He said
That's right.
Frazier was
So
just
if you take Frazier's career from 1969 to 1975, I mean, they were really careful how they managed him then. They
what
didn't
doesn't
overexpose him because Eddie Futch said with a fighter Joe's size, you got to keep a close eye on them because they could go at any time. So they were real careful about who they matched him with.
did he
What's that?
did he fight his whole, the rumor is he fought his whole career blind in one eye because of his diabetes.
No, it was a gym injury. I understood it to be that he had hurt
Okay.
his eye in a gym injury. No, he had his stablemate was Gypsy Joe Harris, who was blind in one eye.
Right.
So, and he ran afoul of the commissions, and he was finished. But Joe and or Gypsy were very close. Gypsy is a whole nother story in himself
Right.
because when he came up in the 60s, he was bigger in Philadelphia than Joe was in the mid 60s because he would wear the long white minks and the cowboy hats and he was a real character, and in the ring he had a million moves, and it was tragic to see his career end the way it did. Joe,
Didn't Joe counsel him for a while and try to
yeah,
get him to
yeah,
calm down?
Joe came back from this, I guess, was in the '80s, and Joe had come back from out of town with some fighters, and he shows back up at the gym, and Gypsy's sleeping on the gym steps on the little slab of concrete in front of the front door, and Joe says, "What are you doing?" He said, Gypsy said he's, just broke. He had no money. Joe brought him in, gave him a shower, gave him some clothes, got him some food, and gave him a job in the gym. But, Gypsy, I think, was kind of bitter that Joe ended up making a lot of money in the game and he didn't. So, it's all laid out in the book, the relationship and
Yeah,
what
you
have
laid
you.
out perfectly in the book. And of course, as you well know, 99% of all fighters don't make any money. It's only the elite
Oh yeah,
like Joe that make good money at it.
that's right. That's right. And Ali, you wonder. See, I'm not real familiar with what his situation was financially, but he got some major endorsement deals after his fighting career.
Right. Ali made
That's
more money after because he signed a deal, I think, for 250 or 300 million to license his image and his name because
right.
anyone could put out a Muhammad Ali T-shirt or mug. So I think he signed with ICM or IGM or some big company, and they paid Ali 250, 300 million. And as a result, I know in Toronto, but every city in the world, all these Ali things started to disappear. There were only one or two sites you could buy it from that were licensed.
Right,
You
right.
know,
So see, Joe wasn't so fortunate, so far as I know.
you,
Um,
do you think Joe
and
lost his desire to fight after he beat Ali the first time?
his desire,
Mm-hmm.
um, well, I think he had reached the peak, and once you're at the peak, uh, it's very hard to sustain the kind of uh, tenacity that you need to stay there. I think that they early was the thought was that they would have a quick rematch, you know, and it would have made sense, right, to have a quick rematch the next year, but the numbers didn't fall in Joe's favor. He wanted more than Ali, and I think that the numbers were tilted in Ali's favor, and Joe resented that,
With good
right?
reason.
So What's that? Yeah,
with good
right,
reason. Yeah.
right, right. Well, Joe felt that Ali was in much the same way that Donald Trump has not accepted the results of the 2020 election.
Right.
Ali started putting out a lot of chatter after he lost the first fight that the judges were racist and that there was all sorts of excuses for him losing the fight. He'd say that out of one side of his mouth, and the other side of the mouth, he would talk about, he would praise Joe as a fighter. So it was hard to know, it wasn't exactly, Ali did not go down easily, put it that way.
No, and
And
he treated him horribly at times.
yeah, I mean, there was a doctor in Britain, I think, who was put out a story that after the fight that Ali looked like he had been drugged. Somebody had put some drugs into his water bottle between rounds. Totally unfounded, total bunch of crap. But the story made its rounds in the papers over here. And so Joe's walking down Broad Street one day, and he comes upon a bunch of kids coming the other way, school age kids, and one of the kids says, "My daddy says you drugged Ali, and you beat him by drugging him." And Joe said he leaned down to the kid, got on his knee, and he said, "I only the only." He showed him, made a fist with his left hand, and he said, "I drug him with this. That was how I drugged him." Anyway,
Well,
or words to that effect. Anyway, the truth of the matter was, I think Joe resented the fact that his achievement had been basically undermined by this sort of nonsense.
especially after he kicked his ass for 15 rounds
Oh God!
and then put him on the mat. I mean, you can't do it any more emphatic than he did.
No, no, no.
I mean, there was a no doubter. What Mike? I have a question for you. No one's been able to answer this. I asked Thomas Hauser and Randy Roberts and other people, esteemed authors such as yourself, this question, but they said it's an interesting theory. My theory was Ali thought, is it possible Ali thought, because I'm making a social stand, not only by not going in the army, but for civil rights for black people, that no other black fighters, especially heavyweights, should be going after a title that belongs to me? Did you think that actually happened to Ali, or is that just overstating it?
That Ali
Resented Joe because he had the temerity to try to make a living as a black man, as a fighter, and go after the title when Ali thought, hey, that's my title, you should support me.
No, I don't. I don't think that's the first I've really heard of that. I don't really think that was a factor. I think that early on, Ali cultivated Joe as as his foil, and in fact, they would ride around Philadelphia, hatching up their plans. Back in '67 and '66, '67, when Ali would come to town, and Ali said he said, "I look at Joe Frazier and I see $10 million." So Ali knew he had a real eye for the eagle, as it were. He knew where he could sense that that Joe was the sort of opponent that the two of them could, cut up some pretty big bread, and so no, I don't think uh, what's the word?
Resented him.
Resented Joe going after, making a living. I think that he was trying to position himself and the two of them in a place where they would have that big payday, and they did. They had it.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's interesting when you look at him calling Terrell and Uncle Tom and calling Joe Frazier the white man's champion, when in fact, Ali grew up in the black middle class in Kentucky, and Frazier grew up dirt poor.
Yeah.
And Ali had white backers of the Louisville sponsoring group,
Yeah.
same as Frazier had white backers. I mean, everything he accused Frazier of, Ali had done himself.
Well, if you, in case you haven't been paying attention, projection is a great tool of the American people. I mean, if
Right.
I say something, it's probably a projection of actually what I'm doing or what I'm saying. Um, you know, but Ali was that was all Gorgeous George stuff. The pro wrestler who Ali sort of cribbed his notes from back in the 60s. Gorgeous George was, kind of like a dandy with these ringlets and the perfumed air, and
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
he would insult his opponents and what have you. Ali felt that I guess you could boil down his point of view. It's good to be loved. It's even better to be hated.
It's
He wanted to put butts in the seats.
That's it. Yeah.
And he was a master promoter. Master promoter.
He said once,
He was a far better promoter than he was a fighter, and he was a great fighter. I mean,
right. Hank Kaplan, the late Hank Kaplan, I'm sure you knew, told me that after he'd been assigned him when he was cast as Clay to be his PR guy, he said about 5 days later, he called Angelo and said, "You're paying me for nothing."
yeah, right. Yeah.
All you got to say to him is, "Hey, how's your morning going?" And he said he's off for 2 hours.
Yeah.
So
it's an interesting thing about Ali. When you were with him individually, he was a totally different person than he was when he had a crowd of more than 2 or 3. He had a real canny sense for when the red light went on, and when the cameras were trained on him, where the notebooks came out. But my dad, who was with him through all his big fights in the 60s and 70s, and made the observation that he would sort of retreat into these, deep silences, when you had him alone. He wasn't, he definitely had an off button, you know. Interesting.
yeah, it's fascinating that the dynamic. I mean, I don't know if they ever really became friends. I read in a Sports Illustrated article that they met before an NBA All-Star game, and when they made peace because of Marvis trying to do this, and they made
Yeah, well, that was the end of my book.
right.
And I had wanted to ask the question or answer the question: Did Joe carry his animus towards Ali to his grave? Did he ever come to terms with it? And my answer is that he did. Although people will dispute that, people that knew Joe and what have you, but I think that he did. I think that his relationship with Ali sort of waxed and waned over the years. He was never quite sure what Ali had up his sleeve. He could never be really quite, you know. Joe was a kind-hearted man who understood that outside of the rings, fighters sort of shared this fraternal relationship. That they competed inside the ring, but outside of the ring, they were there was a brotherhood. And he had never understood why Ali would go into all this nonsense that he did about ratcheting up this hate speech and a lot of this anger he sort of pulled.
Right.
All the fans were he stoked a lot of animosity towards Frazier. Hurled a lot of epithets at Frazier, and he could never quite understood that. But my thing is that it evolved to the point where Ali came to Philadelphia for the NBA All-Star game for an appearance there, and Allie's wife invited Joe and Marvis to come up for dinner to his suite. And I won't spoil it for your audience, but I lay that out at the end of the book, that encounter. And after you're done reading that, I defy you to conclude that there was anything but profound love between the two of them.
Yeah, that had me in tears.
Yeah,
In that part, I know in particular, George Chiavello, that his wife committed suicide. He lost his
I
son,
did. Yeah, sure. Oh,
two
yeah.
other sons to drug overdose, and a granddaughter to cancer. And I know when that happened, Frazier was always the first guy to call him and come up and just be with him.
Right. I knew that. Yeah, I knew that. And um, I think one of George's sons sent
Yeah,
me an email talking about how Joe stepped up during those times, and uh, quite, but that's Joe. That's Joe. Um, there was a lot to like about Joe. A lot to
yeah. I
like
mean,
about
he was when I was young, he was my hero because this was the everyman, the great guy.
him. Yeah,
And
yeah.
Ali had, I think, admitted in subtle ways and not so subtle ways later on that what he was doing before, he was young, he didn't know better, and he was preaching this racist diatribe from the Nation of Islam. But when you look at Ali later, Ali didn't really dislike white people. He had a tremendous fear of what would happen based on what happened to Malcolm X if he left. But after Elijah Muhammad, Ali couldn't leave quick enough.
Oh,
To live
sure.
in,
Yeah, he evolved, Ali. He evolved into a different, you know, as human beings do. You know,
right.
that's what the life's journey is about. To sort of begin one place and to go and to find your way to something else. And I think Ali became a deeply spiritual man. I think to a great degree he regretted. Um, I think he regretted how harsh it became. Some of his uh, remarks about Frazier, how harsh he had been. But I think that what bothered him most deeply was that Joe was so hurt by it. That and how could you not be, considering some of the things that were said?
And
But from
also,
that,
Joe
but
supported him when he was in exile. Joe paid for his
well,
kids to go to school. He gave him money, bought him groceries, paid his mortgage.
right. Well, I don't want to overstate that. He didn't. He lent him some money. It wasn't anything that could that was sustainable for Ali. I mean, he helped him out. He duked him some money, but that was about it. But beyond that, he um,
Didn't
I
Frazier?
lost my train of thought. But
Sorry,
go ahead.
didn't Frazier say to him, can you tone it down? My kids are getting bullied at school.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I don't know whether he said that he directed that at Ali. He might have, but I don't get that. I think that it got back to Ali that that Joe was pissed about that. See, Joe and Ali had writers going back and forth between the two of them, sort of couriers currying information and so forth. So, the best writers had relationships with both of them. So Joe said this, and they would take it back to Ali. Ali would say this, and they'd take it back to Joe. That kind of thing. They all had spies in each other's camps. That was I always enjoyed reading about that. The various spies that was passing on information between the camps. You don't have that today, right? You don't have. I
Right.
mean, remember back in the day, you'd have a fight camp, and the writers would come 2-3 weeks ahead of time, write stories out of the camps. It would build the fight night.
And
There was
these
a
were
whole.
great writers. These are, people were waiting for these articles to come out.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. But you don't have that today. There's a
No.
big fight. There's a big fight, and then It just sort of happens, and
It's
then it's forgotten.
yeah, it's frustrating. I know in Toronto, but it happens everywhere. Where regardless of what a writer says, you can go to the newspapers or radio stations or TV station. I mean, in Canada, there are, except for specific sports, that Canada's version of ESPN, local news doesn't have sportscasters anymore. They've got rid of that, and so many of the, it's basically in Canada, it's owned by two companies, Bell Canada
Right.
and Rogers, and they're getting rid of most of their sports. And when you would say to people that run it there or at the papers or on radio, here are the numbers, and boxing, the live gate, and the pay per views doing way better than MMA, and they would say, no one cares, no one likes boxing, it doesn't count. Even though
Yeah.
you're telling them otherwise.
Well, yeah. Everybody, all the nuance is gone
Mm-hmm.
from sports, in my view, today. It's all hard numbers. It's all about the money. And the money has changed everything
Yeah,
about how
it's outrageous.
not just boxing, but all sports.
Well,
In baseball, for instance, pitchers can't go beyond 5 innings because they're worried about them throwing too many pitches. And but nobody really sits down and tells you that back in the 60s, pitchers were pitching 300 innings and had long careers.
I remember in the 60s watching a game between Bob Gibson, the Cardinals, and Ferguson Jenkins from the Cubs. And I went 14 innings, and there was no relief pitcher, and Jenkins lost.
Yeah.
That would never happen today.
Today that would be front page news, I mean,
yeah, but
people couldn't believe it today.
But I remember when Frazier beat Jimmy Ellis, it was front page news in the Toronto Star. There was a huge picture. Joe Frazier, undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. There is no more doubt. And, and this was more than a sports story. And when Ali fought Wepner, there's a big photo the next day of Wepner standing on his foot, pushing him, and it said the champ was right. It wasn't a knockdown. But you could have a Tyson Fury fight, Floyd Mayweather, Pacquiao. You won't see it in any newspaper here. And when I call them, there only one newspaper in Canada carries it. The other ones don't. Nobody cares.
Vanished. It's vanished.
And when I worked for Lennox Lewis, I would speak to various national and local newspapers, and they would say, yeah, we just cover hockey because of the Raptors and the Blue Jays. We cover hockey, basketball, and baseball. That's it.
Yeah.
We don't cover anything else.
That's it. And now they barely do that.
Yeah. And you were talking about the money. So, as Vladimir Guerrero's not having a good season, but every day in the paper, they're saying he's still going to ask for $50 million.
Yeah.
A season. And you're thinking, you couldn't pay a Mickey Mantle what he's worth today, or a Jackie Robinson, or a Bob Gibson. And you look at what Mayweather and Pacquiao got. Well, according to Joe's accomplishments, he was worth that. If he was around today, you'd have to be paying him hundreds of millions a fight.
What's insidious to me, what's most insidious is how now in the major sports, the money is now flowing from gambling. And this is a bad piece of business in my view.
I agree.
This is basically creating chaos.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of creating chaos in people's lives, preying on the dopamine fix that gambling gives people. It is addictive. It does ruin families. It does lead to all sorts of problems. And yet sports is very willing to overlook that and see beyond that and take the money anyway.
It's incredible because gambling was always an entry for the mob. And
Yeah.
I was able to, I have a book coming out soon about boxing's greatest controversies, but I was able to trace to 1772 the very first unequivocal fixed fight in boxing in
Ah.
England, and they were caught doing it, but gamblers were involved. One guy was paid to lose, and the fans were stupid. The odds changed so quickly before the fight, and fans who bet money, and this was 1700s. These weren't upper class. There was some aristocracy there, but these were commoners who made almost nothing. And then all of a sudden they're hearing, I got ripped off. This wasn't on the level. And, it's a big riot. And I agree with you. Anytime you bring gambling into, I mean, they kicked Pete Rose out for that. And now they're allowing it. It's the wrong.
Now it's the systematic. It's now, but now it used to be the purview of organized crime and what have you. For many years, but now it's systematic. It's on your phone. You can tap in a bet on just about anything at any time. It's so fluid. You have your account and you're just it's just, and they give you, like heroin dealers, they give you a hit. They give you $2,000 to get you hooked into it. It's really, it's so ugly. I can't even begin to describe to you how disgusting I think it is.
Well,
yeah, I mean, it's just terrible.
I have to tell you, when I bet money when Mike Rossman beat Victor Galindez for the light heavyweight title.
Right.
And I doubled the bet in the rematch when Rossman lost, and I was so upset.
Right.
And I said to Dundee, I thought it was a sure thing. And he said, son, there's no such thing as a sure thing. That's why it's called gambling.
That's right. That's right.
And today, when people, I mean, you get this undoubtedly all the time. People say, who should I bet on? And when it comes to boxing, I say, boxing is totally corrupt. There's still mob or criminal element in it. Doesn't matter who you bet on. It may not be the way it should anyways.
Yeah, I guess though now it's become a broader thing, the NFL, and on one hand they sanctimoniously say that they're against gambling by their players and what have you. Baseball is even worse. They whipped Pete Rose like he's a redheaded stepchild for the last 30 years. And yet, on the other hand, they turn around and they get involved with, they set up they have all this cash coming in now from gambling enterprises. So you tell me how hypocritical that is. But, these big contracts, I'd like to know where the ceiling is, because everything has a ceiling.
Right.
Right? Where's the ceiling?
Well, I know. Yeah, I know that. I mean, a friend of mine who was from here, Norm Macdonald, a comedian, who you probably well, he had a gambling problem, so he was banned from casinos, and there was a lot of guys here he owed money to that he lost, and it was a sickness, and he admitted it. But if you're standing with him, the next car is going to be a Chevy, and I would say, I don't bet. I'll bet you $100, and he would do this with everyone, and he would make great money, and he would lose it. And it's a sorry state, the way some sports are like that now.
It's the dopamine rush.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's a drug. It's
a
drug. Chemicals are released in your brain when you bet and win, and when you bet and lose. It's a constant cycle of excitement and disappointment, despair, happiness. It is not. They are preying on people. Sports is preying on people.
Yes, there was a hockey player named Evander Kane for the Edmonton Oilers who declared bankruptcy. His wife was saying, they asked his wife, he made over $300 million and he's still playing. How does he have enough money? And she said he's up all night gambling in all the different sites.
Oh,
You
I'm
can't.
not surprised.
He said,
You know, Lou, we haven't even seen the tip of the iceberg yet on all these stories that are out there, the devastation that's out there. I mean, the New York Times did a very interesting series about 6 months ago or so on this whole issue, and that was scary in itself. But that only scratched the surface. I mean, the money that's being hauled in out of people's bank accounts to fuel the sports, and then forget about that for a minute. And on the other hand, these sports organizations are holding up uh, the local state governments and city governments for handouts to build stadiums of 600 million, 800 million. And it's corporate welfare is what it is. I mean, it's
yeah.
it's but the taxpayer does not get any money flowing back to them, you know, out of
Well,
these investments.
there's a story you may have read about. It broke all across Canada and in the States in some places. The Toronto Blue Jays are owned by a corporation, Rogers. So
Right,
Rogers has a monopoly here on the internet, home telephone, and cable TV. The
right.
Supreme Court of Canada ruled you can't do that, but the government of Justin Trudeau said it's all right.
Yeah.
So they still continue. So what they're doing is they're remodeling the Sky Dome. They're $1 trillion organization, and
Jesus.
they've said there's people that own tickets and have owned it since they played in Exhibition Stadium, another stadium years ago in '76. But these people that own the tickets are the children of sports writers for various Toronto newspapers. They've paid every increase. And so this year they're paying between I guess 30 and 50,000 or more for season tickets. And
Jesus.
they got a letter from the Blue Jays saying because your seat's going to be moved to the left because of renovations. So we're going to need 125,000 extra each year, but we want you to pay it all at once. So in the next 2 weeks, you're going to have to pay it 375,000 to keep
They
your
might
seat.
as well wear a mask.
Yeah, I mean, if they
I
had
just
absolutely, you're right, that's bang on. If they had a gun, they couldn't have robbed them any better. So these people went to the newspaper, and the newspaper asked the baseball team and Rogers, you said that you don't need government help to do this. You have the money to fund the renovation, but you're making
right.
the fans do it. And their attitude is, it's not a court of law. I don't have to answer questions like that. I can do what I
Yeah,
want.
there you go. See, so that's what happens when your newspapers, and this is across America, when they are basically drained of all its resources, pages and staff. When you take them out of the picture, out of the game, these corporations, and particularly in sports, are just they run wild. They run wild,
To me,
and
it's like leaving the mafia alone to govern themselves. I
it's
mean,
it's it's disgusting. And I'll tell you, um, so in 2025, the Thrill in Manila it'll be its 50th anniversary, and it's astonishing to me that how the world has changed since then. How and how basically sports has become so mundane. Uh, it used to be that big events like a fight or a baseball game, you'd see the game of the week on Saturday in baseball. You'd look forward to it because that's the only game you were going to see that week. And the fight, you get the advance reporting, you read about it in the papers. This camp says this, the other camp says that. What's going to happen. You talk to your friends. It would build. Football was every Sunday. You'd sort of look forward to it. It's still every Sunday, but now it's Thursday and now it's Monday. So it's 3 days a week. And it wouldn't surprise me if it went to a fourth day a week at some point. And there's more games. And every game can be seen at any time. You can turn on MLB and get every game that's going on. So my point is that this has drained the romance
Out of sports, yeah.
out of sports.
Well,
That nothing is as uh, what's the word, special as it once was when it comes to sporting events.
the greatest baseball game I ever saw, including when Joe Carter hit the home run for the Blue Jays to win the World Series.
Right.
I'll never forget sitting with my father, my uncles, and cousins watching Carlton Fisk will the home run and to beat the Reds. That was the
Oh,
greatest
sure.
baseball game I ever saw in my life.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
Every inning,
Absolutely.
you were standing up cheering.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And same with
So,
Thrill in Manila. I watched a Thrill in Manila at Maple Leaf Garden, and my friend's father took us. He was vice president of Panasonic, so we had a booth. But in the
right.
booth, you couldn't see out the window. So we're watching it, and around the 11th round, Mark, he actually said, "Well, boys, it's a late night. I got to get you home." I said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not leaving. There's no way I'm damn well leaving." And he looked at me like, "Excuse me?" I said, "I'll take the subway home." And he said, "You're 15." I said, "I don't care. I'm not leaving." And so
Jeez.
we stood out in the stands and we watched it with our, like everyone else in the gardens. We just had our head on our hands going, how is this going to end? I mean, Frazier's still coming after him.
Yeah. 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 It's
And
astonishing, It's
that's the
and,
most
in doing
incredible
my
thing I
book,
ever saw.
one of the great pleasures of doing my book, I should say, was that I got to go back and read all the sports reporting that was done in the
It's a
60s.
great book.
Yeah, in the 60s and 70s, the columnists and what have you. Um, and you really, it was such a huge help to me writing the book because I got a sense of really what was going on in the camps and the fighters' heads. But can you imagine someone writing a book about, I don't know, pick a star from today, Floyd Mayweather, for instance, or any other athlete? Future biographers are going to have nothing to draw on.
That's
There's
right.
there's these guys are not accessible. It's a very one-dimensional picture that people are going to be presented with, I think. So I don't know. I guess you had to be there, right?
Yeah, I was lucky to be in the movie Cinderella Man and spent all that time with Angelo.
Oh,
And so no was on set. I got to speak to him, but I really
mhm.
love speaking with Bud Schulberg.
Oh,
And
sure.
Bud was there when Dempsey fought Willard, and he said his hands weren't wrapped because I was in the dressing room with my father, who was the head of Paramount Pictures. He knew Dempsey, and
Oh, yeah.
he said Willard's trainer Walter Moynihan was there and said the wraps are kosher, and he said you see him walking in the ring with his wraps. So he
Uh-huh.
said it was great, but he said himself only Dan Parker was the only other guy that spoke out against the mob in the 50s. But he said back then, New York, and I'm sure Philly, New York had like 40 dailies. So you could read Jimmy Cannon, you
Oh,
know,
sure.
Damon Runyon or much earlier, and all these fantastic writers. And to me, it's just the level, like in your book, it's just brilliant. You don't see sports writing like that today. This was
Well,
art.
thank you. Yeah, thank
No,
you.
I mean, your book was art. You don't see that today.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, yourself, and I mean, there won't be anyone like those guys, yourself, your father, anyone else around again. It just doesn't happen that you'll see such a wealth of sport. Shirley Povich was another one who I
yeah,
loved to read.
I know. I know. All the papers when we lived in New York in the mid 60s, when I was a little boy, across the street there was a newsstand, and on Sunday morning there'd be 12 papers, New York papers, stacked up.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? Just
Unbelievable.
just an astonishing time, really. And I
My
get
my
go ahead.
Mhm. Well, my father's favorite fighter as a kid was Al Bummy Davis.
Yeah,
Ron Ross wrote a book on him, the lightweight that was killed in a saloon robbery. But
right.
in Toronto, there was just one sentence: Jew fighter killed in New York.
Jeez.
That was it. So he called his relatives in New York, and they sent up like 20 papers, and they all had these long page articles about what really happened.
Oh wow.
And he
Yeah.
said it was heartbreaking, but it gave you the whole story. It gave you the truth.
I see. I see.
And he said, now these days it just, there's no headlines even with boxing
I know.
or whatever. They can't be bothered. They look down on sports writing. They don't look at it, and they don't look at the great writers such as yourself, Hemingway, and other people, Bernard Shaw, George Bernard Shaw, and other people who wrote about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's a one of my goals is to put together my father's boxing pieces in time for the 50th anniversary of the Thrill in Manila. So at
That'd be
least
great.
at least preserve just his boxing pieces. He wrote about many other things, and I did publish a book of his magazine work. It's called Great Men Die Twice, which has
I
some
I,
boxing in
I
it.
read that the other night in a book I have by George, I think called The Big Fights.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I read that article. Great man died twice. It was wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. So my goal is to put that out in a few years, um, just as a marker that there was a sport called boxing and there was some marvelous uh, writing about it, and you know, so
Also, the writing, the humor in the writing,
yeah.
was great. I don't know if it was Jimmy Cannon who said about Henry Cooper and Ali, sleep befell Henry Cooper as it must befall all British heavyweights midway through the first round.
Yeah,
And I think Cannon also wrote with George Chiavello that when he fought Frazier, that he became indignant when a punch missed him.
that's pretty funny. That's pretty
And
funny.
just brilliant writing all the way around, and boxing and baseball.
Yeah, I know. I know. The times they have changed.
Yeah, and the younger guys coming up, a lot of them, it just isn't there. They don't have the passion or the background that these guys had, or the skill.
Well, they don't
Same
have
as the
the.
athletes.
Well, they don't have the venue to write this word.
That's
There's
true.
nowhere to write anymore. Where are they going to
Right.
write? I'd hate to be a young writer today. I don't know what I'd do. I don't know how you can make a living.
It's not easy, and I'm not young. and and I know from your, with your father. I mean, as you know, people would stand there and wait for his thing to come out at the
Oh,
paper.
sure. Oh,
They'd
yeah.
wait and say, "Is it out yet? I want to read Mark Kram," you
Yeah.
know, and they'd line up, and so it doesn't. I don't know anyone lining up for newspapers anymore.
No, no, no. It's just most of them are zombie papers, they're just sort of,
Yeah.
just sort of, it's a sad thing.
Well, I just want to say, first of all, not only is the book brilliant, but the amount of people you have, magnificent people here, Jonathan Eig, Joyce Carol Oates, who loved the book, John Julian, who co-wrote a book with George Kimball,
Yes.
and the great George Kimball, and Mike Leahy. And that's a wonderful picture. But I love the picture of him with his mother and sitting on the porch, and also the picture of him grabbing a Valley grabbing his jacket. Frazier was really well dressed. He was a real sport,
Yeah.
when
Oh, yeah.
he was dressed to the nines.
Yeah. Yeah. He was at that time, I think Stan Hochman, who wrote for the Daily News for many years, Philly Daily News, said that Joe had a doorman-like politeness. which was well said. He was a very clean cut guy, you know. Yeah, so
Well,
uh,
when I saw him in the bar, he seemed to be, I don't know if he was on edge or whatever, but the minute Chivalo walked in, you could see all that, if it was tension, whatever, just drown away. As I said, both their arms went out. Like, here's a
yeah,
guy, this is my brother, I don't have to fear him. And when he would call, uh, he would call George's house every day, so this is Joe from Philadelphia calling Chivalo in TO, and they all knew it was him, and they his son told me they would speak for hours, and I was
yeah.
like, Dad, you're supposed to take us to the park. I'll be with you in 5 minutes, and his son would say the same stuff every day, right? But we're friends. That's what friends do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've read a lot about George Chuvalo over the years. I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but he was certainly someone I admired. That's for sure.
Yeah, he lucked out because when Frazier broke his orbital bone, the surgery to save the eye didn't exist in Canada.
Is that right?
Yeah, he said it's because he had it in New York. His eye was safe. If it was in Canada, he would have lost the eye.
Jeez, that was a fierce beating.
It was a tremendous beating. Yeah, he said he'd never been hit like that. He said Foreman hit me, and it didn't come close to that. And
what did George say? That it was like being hit by someone with four hands.
yeah, it's like a gang attacking him.
Yeah.
Just he said it's like his head felt like a speed bat. But he said
Jeez.
Frazier was not only strong, he hit his left hook well, and he said the power he generated, and it was just so quick. He said he never got credit for the hand speed that he had.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he said,
Well, it's obvious. Yeah, his hand speed was terrific.
And he said, I'm less than 2 feet from him, and I can't land a punch. He won't stop moving from side to side and bobbing and weaving. He said, you can't get him. He said, I was surprised when Foreman beat him because Joe was not an easy guy to tag.
Yeah, well, the first fight, Joe was not. His head wasn't in the game down in Jamaica. Right. He wasn't.
He didn't take.
First of all, he brought his whole family down, and it was a party atmosphere. And Joe was not. He was sparring with Ken Norton, and Norton was not yet. He had not yet emerged on the national scene. He had not yet beaten Ali, broke his jaw. But Eddie Futch, Norton went to Eddie Futch and said, he's off. He's a few seconds off, or a split second off. And Futch had to lay Norton off from sparring, so Joe wouldn't lose confidence. So he was just not on his game. He had diminished by the time he fought Foreman, and physically he was not. Foreman was much bigger. It was going to be a tough night for him, I think, under any circumstances. But given the shape he was in, I think it was. It wasn't going to happen.
Well, Angelo was doing the color commentary, and he reamed out Arthur Mercanti after, and he said, "You trying to get the man killed?
Yeah,
you should have stopped it." He kept getting up. So what? He keeps getting up. It's Joe Frazier. You could run a tank at him. He's going to get up. That's not the point. It was enough.
Yeah.
And same as Angelo, and I know Yank Durham both hated Tony Perez. I mean, Ali, like you said in the book, over 100 times kept pushing Joe's head down, and Perez didn't.
Right. I know.
Oh, and that's not, you're not allowed. You get warned for that, and then you lose a point. Perez did nothing, not once.
That's right. That could have the way a different referee could have changed that whole fight.
Hmm.
Could have turned that whole fight around. Plus, it was 12 rounds the second fight.
Right.
So
Right.
I think that, yeah.
And the thrill in Manila, when he tried to do it, Padilla would knock his arm.
Yeah.
So it's. I mean, as your wonderful book says, and as you've said, there'll never be another fight like that. There'll never be another era like that because
Yeah.
it captured the whole world. The entire
Yes.
planet was focused on that one fight.
Yes. 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 Yeah. It was really something. I was glad that I was honored to have a chance to write about it.
I know.
Honestly, so it really was a special moment in time.
Listen. I just want to say thank you so much.
Sure.
It's been a
I've
pleasure
really.
having you on. I want to have you on again when you bring out the other book
Mm-hmm.
with your father's writing. I'd like to have you on
Okay.
again and the book is available. Where can people buy the book? On Amazon?
Amazon, any of the
Barnes and Noble?
Barnes and Noble. If you contact me, you can buy a copy and I'll sign it. You can
Oh, that's wonderful.
reach me on my website. So it's
What is your website? What's the name?
um,
How can I?
it's www.markkramjr.com.
Okay, it's simple enough.
And and I'm on Facebook. You can reach me through there. Most people seem to reach me through Facebook. So there's numerous places the book can be purchased, and I'd sure be happy if you did.
Yes, I got to tell you, when I saw it in the bookstore here, I walked by it and then went, "Wait a minute." I walked back, and my wife said, "You're going to buy it. So don't look at the price. Just get it and buy it." And I said,
Well, I'm glad
point.
you could find it up there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's still. We have Indigo's and Chapter up here, same company, and so this is in all the stores.
Oh, great!
And
That's great.
If you can find it, I mean, it's usually sold out, but if you can find it.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm glad people are finding the book because I think Joe is a worthy subject to read about. I think to write and read about.
And you do it so beautifully, and like yourself, Joe was a true gentleman, and to me, he defined the term world champion.
He did.
He was the champion of everyone, regardless of race, creed, color, gender. He liked everyone, and I'm glad you said he knew how loved he was.
Oh
by
yeah.
So many people.
Yes, he did. He certainly did.
Because even today, when you see fighters fighting in any division, he's a bit like Joe Frazier, and I always think no one was like Joe Frazier. No one had that level of skill and talent.
Yeah, I was grateful to have had a chance to have met Joe and gotten to know Joe. It was really something.
That must have been incredible.
Okay.
I mean, a living legend, one of the all-time great champs.
Yep, he certainly was.
Well, I want to say thank you again for being on, and we'd love to have you on again soon. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. And hopefully we will see you again soon.
Okay, take care, Lou.
You too, Mark. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay. Oh,